Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining with us today at the second session of the third Philippine Koreanist Congress. So we will begin in a few moments. So please don't forget to follow the Facebook page of the UPK Research Center for more updates on the Congress and other events. So we'll be starting in a few moments. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of the third Philippine Koreanist Congress. This online event is organized by the University of the Philippines Korea Research Center and sponsored by the Academy of Korean Studies in South Korea. I am Anton Miranda from the Foreign Service Institute, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to welcome our participants who are joining with us today in the safety of their homes through UPKRC's YouTube channel. Before we begin our program, we would like to remind our viewers on some house rules. You may send your questions and comments throughout the presentations and discussions in the YouTube chat room. If possible, please introduce yourself with your name and affiliation when raising questions. The questions will then be collected and flashed on your screen during the open forum. Please don't forget to use our official hashtags for today. So that's hashtag UPKRC and hashtag 3PKC. At this point, please allow me to provide a brief background of the organizers of today's program. The UP Korea Research Center was launched in April 2016 to provide Filipino scholars and researchers with opportunities to widen their interest in Korean studies. The center conducts various academic and cultural activities for scholars and professionals and serves as a university-wide hub that promotes and develops Korean studies in the Philippines. For more information and updates on UPKRC, you may visit their Facebook page at www.facebook.com/UPKRC. This year's edition of the Philippine Koreanist Congress is centered on the theme Revisiting Diversity and Multiculturalism in Contemporary Korea, Trans-Border Relations and Policy Implications. This event will feature 7 quality research papers focusing on the underlying political, economic, and social-cultural dynamics of inter-Korean relations, the prospects and challenges of dialogue and reconciliation between the two Koreas, as well as the portrayal of North and South Korea in Philippine media. For those who missed last week's presentation with our keynote speaker, Dr. Brendan Howe from Iwo Women's University, you may rewatch the first session of the Congress uploaded in the UPKRC YouTube channel. For today's session, we will be highlighting 2 significant milestones in South Korea's foreign policy within the last 3 years. First, the new Southern policy unveiled in 2017 concretized South Korea's commitment to engage with ASEAN in a holistic manner. This entails various implications for South Korea's emerging status as a middle power and ASEAN's significance in regional security and economic dynamics. Second, inter-Korean relations made a breakthrough in 2018 when North and South Korea marched together in the Pyeongchang Olympics and Asian Games in Indonesia. Although optimism towards reconciliation seems to have dissipated due to deadlocks in political security and nuclear negotiations, the appeal of international cultural and sports events demonstrates the impact of soft power in achieving diplomatic outcomes. This afternoon, we are privileged to have our distinguished speakers who will share their invaluable insights on these topics. So please allow me to introduce our first speaker for today's session. Our first speaker is currently the chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is concurrently the co-convener of the Strategic Studies Program at the Center for Integrative and Development Studies of the University of the Philippines System. He has made numerous contributions to academic journals, fora, and unofficial dialogues on Philippine foreign and security policy, ASEAN centrality, and regional civil society. To deliver his presentation on ASEAN-ROK security cooperation in a changing strategic environment, let us all welcome Professor Herman Joseph Kraft. Whenever you're ready, Professor Kraft.
Right. Thank you very much, Anton. And thank you very much to the organizers of the Third Philippine Koreanist Congress for inviting me to give me a chance to actually talk about this issue on ASEAN Republic of Korea security cooperation. One of the things that I think has been a significant part of the past few months for all of us, no, has been the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the question that actually comes to mind is to what extent has the pandemic actually transformed or changed, no, the strategic environment that we actually have, and basically, has anything changed, no, as far as that's actually concerned? Um, One of the assumptions is that a pandemic actually generates the urge to cooperate. No, that this is one of the um, uh, many issues that has been at the forefront, no, of um, uh, factors that actually lead to or contribute to the idea of intensifying institutional and even institutionalizing cooperation across the region. Okay, um, but at the same time, no, I think that's the point that actually has to be addressed here. Has COVID-19 actually transformed the strategic environment that we actually have? Um, and what does that strategic environment look like now? No, um, and to a certain extent, these are questions that I will be discussing. No, as I discuss ASEAN Korea security cooperation. No, in the context of a strategic environment that's evolving. No, but evolving in what way? Okay. Um, This is a picture, no, that was taken last year during the commemorative summit, no, held in Busan. Okay, basically to celebrate the 30th anniversary of ASEAN Korea relations. No, and I show this picture, no, because of the significance of uh, I guess the backdrop, no, where it talks about the partnership for peace, prosperity, and for people. Okay, now the three P's here: peace, prosperity, and people. These are actually the three P's that, to a large extent, no, characterize what uh, Anton actually mentioned earlier on, no, about the initiative, no, that the Republic of Korea initiated in 2017 regarding what it referred to as the new Southern policy, no, of South Korea. Okay. The new Southern policy, well, at this point in time, actually, there have been quite a number of fora that's sought to actually discuss the points about what the new Southern policy is all about. Okay, but to bring this back to its origins, no, um, uh, the idea behind the new Southern policy was actually represented by the Prime Minister of Korea, in 2017, okay, when he announced, that he wanted to actually elevate Korea's relationship with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to the level of its relations with the four major powers around the Korean Peninsula. In other words, what um, uh, uh, what uh, 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 what was actually being pushed at this point in time, was the notion that what needed to be done, was an intensification of the relationship, between ASEAN and the Republic of Korea, and the notion was to actually expand, the relationship, to cover a number of key pillars, and across those pillars, to expand the involvement between South Korea and the and ASEAN. Okay. Um, Fundamentally, okay, the pillars are actually the three P's that were mentioned earlier on. So we talk about the idea of economic relations being intensified. And I think as far as the notion of prosperity is concerned, at the 16th ASEAN Economic Ministers and Republic of Korea consultation meeting that was actually held last year in Bangkok, um, the progress as far as economic relations was concerned, was actually seen, in terms of the way by which economic relations were growing, at a fairly regular pace, across different areas. Two-way trade between ASEAN and Korea actually grew by 4.4%. No, and the total merchandise of trade is actually growing at 5.7%. There was a strong surge of foreign direct investments, in 2018, amounting to around 6.6 US 6.6 billion US dollars. And South Korea actually remains ASEAN's fifth largest trading partner, especially if you talk about trading partner and one of the key sources of FDI, among ASEAN's dialogue partners. Okay, and one of the things that's actually quite key to this partnership, is the commitment made by the Republic of Korea to ensuring that the regional cooperation and economic prosperity would actually be, or economic programs that would push through. Now, the RCEP is, of course, the free trade arrangement, that ASEAN has actually been pushing for some time now. Okay, and one of the things that ASEAN has sought, is the support of its dialogue partners in trying to push the institutionalization of the RCEP, even as it has established, a number of bilateral free trade arrangements, with many of its dialogue partners. So, in other words, even as the RCEP is actually being pushed forward as a regional arrangement, ASEAN and Korea also have their own bilateral free trade arrangement, which has also been moving forward, as far as the institutionalization of the arrangement is actually concerned. So, in other words, okay, as far as the pillar on prosperity is concerned, on the new Southern policy, okay, Korea ASEAN relations has been moving forward, quite well. On the people to people side of things, in the progress here has also been noted, and this can be seen in the chairman's statement of the ASEAN Post-Ministerial Conference, with the Republic of Korea, which was actually issued just a few weeks ago. Okay, mention was made of the Republic of Korea's continued support in promoting cultural cooperation and closer people-to-people ties, including the expansion of scholarships, and the activities of the ASEAN Korea Center in Seoul and the ASEAN Cultural House in Busan. Okay, it's not surprising right now that, for instance, in the Philippines, quite a number of Filipino students are in Korea doing their graduate work, for instance. Okay, I think quite a few of the beneficiaries of those programs are actually part of this conference right now. Okay, there has also been enhanced cooperation on digital education and human resource development. More so within the context, of course, of the conditions that have been forced upon us by the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, the Republic of Korea has been one of the key supports, in strengthening ICT programs, for schools in ASEAN member states. Okay, given the conditions that we face now with regards to online learning, for instance, the support provided by South Korea is not something that we can actually disconsider in terms of its importance and significance. There have been a number of memoranda of understanding signed between the ASEAN and South Korea. In particular, the MOU between the ASEAN Cultural Center in Bangkok and the ASEAN Cultural House in Busan, which was signed in 2019, as well as the quite obvious progress that you can see in terms of film development, and interest, as far as organizations between ASEAN and the ROK is concerned. Korean telenovelas are very, very popular in the in ASEAN. Not to speak of the Philippines in particular. As well as, of course, Kpop being one of the key elements, of the cultural relationships, between between the Southeast Asian countries now, as well as South Korea. Now, the third pillar, though, is a different thing altogether. In 2017, when the new Southern policy was actually initiated, many observers actually said that there won't be any problems as far as the economic, and the people-to-people side of things are concerned. It was the security side, that was, I think, one Korean scholar actually described it as being underthought of. Meaning to say that there was not a lot of things that were actually placed within the basket of security cooperation between South Korea and ASEAN. This is not surprising, because within ASEAN, for that matter, security tends to be an issue area that is given quite a bit of importance, but at the same time, when it comes to operational conditions, there are a lot of things that ASEAN has actually been unable to do on the security side of things. Okay, nonetheless, this is in fact one of the areas that I think ever since the new Southern policy was actually initiated, where there has been quite a lot of progress, as far as ASEAN and the Republic of Korea is actually concerned. Okay, during the commemorative summit in Busan last year, for instance, the joint vision statement, which actually outlined the areas of cooperation envisioned between the leaders of ASEAN and South Korea, actually noted 4 points as far as the peace pillar is actually concerned. Number one has to do with strengthening regional cooperation for peace and stability by continuing ASEAN Republic of Korea coordination and supporting ASEAN centrality and ASEAN-led mechanisms in the evolving security architecture. Now, this is going to be something that's key, and it's going to be a recurring theme as I actually proceed with my presentation. But the important thing here is the idea of strong the strong Korean commitment to the cooperation with ASEAN on matters pertaining to regional security, as well as, of course, the support given by South Korea to the notion of ASEAN centrality and multilateralism, as seen in terms of the ASEAN lead mechanisms. Number two and number three actually continues to emphasize the idea of cooperation. Now, number two actually talks about enhanced cooperation in security areas to address both traditional and non-traditional security challenges. Okay, this is important, in the context, of course, the idea of health as one of the non-traditional security challenges that we're actually facing. Meaning to say that one would actually expect that the COVID-19 pandemic would be would have pushed the importance of region-wide cooperation as far as addressing the issue is concerned. Okay, in much the same way that previous pandemics were seen as having been successfully addressed only through transnational cooperation. Okay. There's something very different about that nowadays, however, as far as the COVID-19 issue is concerned. The third one actually talks about deepening strategic relations, promoting mutual trust and confidence, and pursuing peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with universally recognized principles of international law. This is going to be quite important when we start talking about, and later on, I'll be emphasizing the extent to which the issue of maritime disputes actually emphasizes this particular point, that there has to be some common ground in terms of understanding a common ground as far as a framework for resolving those issues are concerned. And that's supposed to be international law. How we understand that, of course, is a key point to the issues that we're facing right now. Okay, but together with number one, no, it's the fourth item, no, and the fourth item, no, is something that we can segue from number three actually. The fourth item that's actually discussed, no, within the joint vision statement for peace, prosperity, and partnership, no, um, uh, has to do with enhancing maritime security and safety, the freedom of navigation in and over flights over the region, and other useful, lawful uses of the seas, no, and unimpeded lawful maritime commerce. Again, the emphasis here is on the need to recognize, no, principles of international law, in particular, no, the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. Again, the emphasis here is on the idea that um, problems as far as territorial disputes between countries in the region, no, needs need some sort of common foundational basis, no, for discussing these issues, and that is where I think international actually comes in, and that's where I think a lot of the issues, no, as far as a strategic environment is concerned, need to be understood. But the point here is that number one and number four, no, are key elements, no, as far as the way that South Korea actually approaches, okay, the pillar on peace, no, for its on the new southern policy, right? One emphasizes the need for coordination and support for ASEAN, and the second one, and number four, actually emphasizes, no, what is increasingly one of the most increasingly one of the most important areas, no, of strategic relevance, no, for the region. Okay, so to a large extent, no, the support provided by the Republic of Korea to these two points, no, through the joint vision statement, no, illustrates, no, the extent to which Korea and ASEAN are actually working on the notion of establishing common ground, no, for cooperation. Okay. One of the most important things, I think, no, that becomes important, as far as the cooperation between South Korea and ASEAN is actually concerned, no, is actually situated in the co-chair statement at the 2019 commemorative summit. Okay, in that statement, no, there's an aspect where I think a new initiative that was promoted by ASEAN, no, was actually taken into consideration, not only taken into consideration, but fully supported, no, by the Republic of Korea. And this has to do with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Okay, not only did the ROK actually repeat, no, and emphasize its continuing support for ASEAN centrality, no, as far as the regional architecture is concerned, no, but it also emphasized its continuing support, or its support, no, for the way that ASEAN, no, frame, no, the situation in the Indo-Pacific. So along these lines, no, the outlook, which was actually adopted at the 34th ASEAN Summit, no, is pushed by ASEAN to be used as a guide in promoting possible cooperation within the existing and future initiatives of ASEAN with its external partners. And that includes the ROK. And the fact that the ROK has already indicated its support means that it is more than willing to accept or to adopt, no, the way that ASEAN has actually framed the situation as far as the Indo-Pacific is actually concerned. Okay. Now, what exactly is this frame? No, how does ASEAN actually talk about, no, the Indo-Pacific, and what are the main concerns here? Okay. adopted at the 34th ASEAN Summit, no, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, emphasized, 4 points, no, that are seen as key elements, no, in the way that ASEAN actually sees itself, okay, within the Indo-Pacific. Number one is that the Indo-Pacific is actually seen as an integrated and interconnected region within ASEAN, no, or within which ASEAN plays a central and strategic role. Okay, so in other words, even as um, we expand, no, the scope within which ASEAN sees ASEAN centrality actually at play, okay, um, the very fact of it doesn't deny the fact that ASEAN continues to play, that central and strategic role. Okay, so ASEAN centrality is still very much a key component, of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Second, the Indo-Pacific is seen as a region of dialogue cooperation instead of rivalry. Dialogue and cooperation instead of rivalry. No, so it's an emphasizing of, the continued framing, or the way by which ASEAN continues to frame the regional security architecture. That to a large extent, security issues, are supposed to be dealt with, through cooperation, and disputes are supposed to be dealt with through dialogue. No, to a large extent, this is a continuation of the way that the ASEAN way, of doing business, continues to be part of, okay, what ASEAN sees as an expansion of the scope, of ASEAN centrality. Third, the Indo-Pacific is seen as a region of development and prosperity for all. This is pretty much self-explanatory, meaning to say that the idea of cooperation extends not only in terms of, security, but also as far as the idea of economic cooperation is actually concerned. And finally, and I think this is a key point, or a key element, of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, um, it's the recognition that the Indo-Pacific is a region where the maritime domain constitutes an important part, and where the evolving regional architecture continues to be a key point, to maintaining peace, stability, and prosperity. So this goes back to number one, and number two, where it talks about the idea of the role played by ASEAN, okay, and of course of ASEAN-led institutions, okay, that constitute what is referred to as the regional architecture. What is probably important here, okay, is the emphasis given to the importance of recognizing that it is a maritime, or a predominantly maritime domain, right? One of the things that we have to actually take into consideration is many of the intramurals within ASEAN, uh, uh, on matters that pertain to regional security actually emanate from a disagreement, in how the member states of ASEAN should collectively see, the strategic, or appreciate the strategic domain, of ASEAN. Um, the countries in mainland Southeast Asia tend to actually look at issues, that pertain to the maritime domain in a way that's different from how countries like the Philippines and Indonesia would actually appreciate them, right? Hence, for instance, in 2000, when the issue of Bajo de Masinloc, or Scarborough Shoal, actually erupted in around 2012, ASEAN was unable to actually come up with a common common statement, or a joint statement for the first time, in its storied career, simply because, the idea was that, or it was actually represented that the issue that the Philippines wanted to be placed in that communique should include, Scarborough Shoal, and the way that China has actually been acting, as far as the South China Sea is concerned. Okay, the chair of ASEAN during that time was Cambodia, and Cambodia's position was actually clear. No, the South China Sea is an issue that does not concern the whole of ASEAN, right? That this is something that only concerns those that are actually involved in the dispute. No, effectively, effectively cutting or creating a division, which has geographically been there in as far as the Southeast Asian states are concerned, between the strategic concerns of continental Southeast Asian countries, and the strategic concerns, of maritime Southeast Asian countries. The main problem here, is that if that division, or lack of a common appreciation for ASEAN strategic concerns continues, then we can understand why it is so difficult to actually come up with a common ASEAN stand, on issues that have to do with the South China Sea, China, for instance, and so on. Okay, but what we can see in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, is an ASEAN statement which actually gives emphasis not to the maritime domain, or the importance, of the maritime domain, to the strategic environment, of ASEAN. So in other words, in this kind of context, it is no longer going to be easy for ASEAN member states, in the in continental Southeast Asia to actually point to the idea that things that are going on in South China Sea is something that only involves the maritime ASEAN states, and it's not necessarily something that that concerns the whole of ASEAN. Okay, in citing that the Indo-Pacific is a maritime domain, okay, means that it's an it is an acceptance within ASEAN, of the importance, in looking at that strategic environment, with due consideration, for its maritime characteristics. Okay, so the thing here is that this is how ASEAN, is trying to frame that strategic environment. This framing is something that South Korea has accepted, within the context of its relationship with ASEAN. Okay, it supports the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, right? And to a large extent, it is this support for the ASEAN outlook, is reflective of South Korea's continued support for, what ASEAN stands for, as far as regional security is actually concerned. That is to say, the driver, of a a set of multilateral institutions, which constitutes, what has been accepted as a regional architecture. In other words, it's a formation. It is a structure, that has been at the center of the region's security, not just Southeast Asia, but to a large extent, it has had its impact, on Northeast Asia and the South Pacific as well. Now, the acceptance of an Indo-Pacific framework, a geographic framework, means that ASEAN centrality now extends, in terms of its concerns, or its the way that it actually is part of that regional structure, now extends in its geographic scope, not to include, the Indian Ocean region. Okay, so this is essentially the extent now of where ASEAN centrality is supposed to be at to take effect, so to speak. As far as those ASEAN multilateral arrangements are concerned, the ASEAN-led multilateral arrangements, and the idea of an ASEAN-driven regional architecture. You can see how extensive that region is, and of course begs the question, of what exactly is it that ASEAN can do, when when we talk about stability, cooperation, in the context of that geographic scope. Um, well, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific um, uh, um, identifies four key areas, no, of cooperation. One is in the area of connectivity, basically the notion that the ASEAN states need to enhance their connectivity, both physical, no, social, cultural, um, and the extent to which this actually creates, no, a stronger community. Okay, and so in that particular context, no, um, ASEAN actually sees its dialogue partners as partners, no, in enhancing, no, the connectivity between the ASEAN states. Then secondly, it talks about, no, the idea of pursuing, no, the UN Sustainable Goals, no. So the idea of sustainable development, no, and the commitment to enhancing, no, the conditions of people in the region, no, is something that is part of the ASEAN uh, outlook on the Indo-Pacific. No, so you can see here elements that have to do with social connectivity, no, physical connectivity, and then, no, number three talks about economic and areas, other areas of cooperation. So, in other words, we're talking about the idea, no, the very traditional notions, no, of where ASEAN has been very active in terms of promoting, okay, the cooperation across the region, no, within ASEAN, no, and then outside of ASEAN. It's again, and like I said, the fourth item is actually interesting precisely because it again goes back to what we were saying earlier on, the increasing recognition of the importance of the maritime characteristic, no, of the Indo-Pacific as a region, no. But one of the interesting things that, here is that in talking about or emphasizing that maritime characteristic, no, it begs the question. Of course, within the AOIP, for instance, no, it tends to actually emphasize things that have to do with transnational crime, the environment, research, right? But talking about maritime cooperation, and then going back to what I was talking about earlier on, no, in terms of the importance or the significance, no, of um, dealing with regional issues, no, and emphasizing the need to recognize or to use international law as a basis for, no, settling these kinds or addressing these kinds of issues, and then emphasizing the importance of UNCLOS, no, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, no, in that context, no, seems to actually funnel things down to, okay, uh, an increasing emphasis, no, on the maritime aspect of ASEAN cooperation. Okay, and again, going back to South Korea's commitments, no, these are the things that South Korea has actually become very certain about, no, in terms of its cooperation with ASEAN. Okay, now, so to emphasize some essential points here, okay, is that as ASEAN actually seeks to emphasize, no, these mechanisms, no, um, across the region, multilateral arrangements, no, um, uh, the Republic of Korea has actually emphasized its continued commitment to stick to strengthening, no, cooperation through those ASEAN-led mechanisms, through ASEAN-led multilateral arrangements. No, in particular, no, mention was made of the ASEAN, or a repeated mention was made of the ASEAN plus three process, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the ASEAN Defense Ministers meetings plus. Okay. Um, and then secondly, okay, is that as as Korea has actually repeatedly stated the importance of these ASEAN-led mechanisms, no, Parallel to that is the continued support that Korea has actually expressed, no, for ASEAN centrality. Okay. Now, this essential point is actually going to be important, no, because it goes back to the meaning of the or the points that have to do with the new Southern policy. Okay. That is to say that the new Southern policy is important to the affirmation of South Korea's increasing self-identification, no, as a middle power. Okay, so support for ASEAN and the regional security architecture built around ASEAN, no, constitutes part of, no, that notion of South Korea as a middle power. Okay, now the discussion over the middle power status of the Republic of Korea, no, um, in the literature has revolved around a number of things, no, which are related to each other, but as far as the literature is concerned, tend to go in different places, no. It has either uh, uh, been discussed in the context of alliance politics, no. So we're talking about the relationship, no, of the Republic of Korea as part of, no, the bilateral set of alliances, no, that the United States has established in the region, no, since the end of the Second World War, no. Um, or it's been seen in terms of its diplomatic role, no, in the context of the Korean Peninsula issue. So, in other words, what is interesting here is one aspect of the Republic of Korea's middle power status, no, has to do with traditional, very traditional security issues, right? Alliance politics, right? Meaning to say its relationship with the United States in particular, and of course the issue of the Korean Peninsula. Okay, although in this sense, no, it's not seen in terms of the military to military confrontation, but seen in terms of the importance, no, of emphasizing diplomacy, no, in trying to ensure, no, that the Korean Peninsula issue doesn't cascade into nor slide into, no, an all-out war. Okay, but then again, no, there have been those who have actually said that South Korea's middle power or the characteristics behind, no, uh, uh, of South Korea's self-identification as a middle power, no, um, is still something that lacks, no, um, expression, no, precisely because being a middle power means or is understood to mean, no, that it has to do with actually coming up with sustainable and intellectually creative, no, policy initiatives, right? So Australia, no, Canada are countries that are actually identified as middle powers, no, not because of their material capacities, no, but precisely because of the moral suasion that they've actually been able to exercise, no, through initiatives, no, that they've introduced into the international system, no. Um, in this context, now South Korea is seen as some, sorry, in this context, this is where the new Southern policy becomes important because it's seen as, no, an affirmation, no, of that capacity of South Korea to actually come up with sustainable and intellectually creative policy initiatives, right? And in particular, no, is the impact that this actually have, no, on the peace component of the new Southern policy. Okay, so it's important to understand that a significant part of the Korea's continued support for ASEAN, no, ASEAN-led multilateralism, no, is a component of this self-identification as a middle power. That being a middle power means that the Republic of Korea has to be able to influence, no, regional dynamics in some way. No, not being a great power means that this then has to be done through moral suasion, no, and the introduction of initiatives, no, that would actually contribute, no, to the enhancement of regional security and stability, no. And in this context, okay, um, Korea's um, uh, Korea sees its partnership with ASEAN, no, as a conduit, no, precisely towards that kind of self identification. Okay. Um, the NSP and the push to strengthen Korea ASEAN relations, no, is actually illustrative of the fact that middle powers are seen as states that support multilateralism, no, and that seek compromise and pursue good international citizenship as a worthwhile interest, no, or area of interest, no. And so the idea of South Korea's soft power and public diplomacy, no, as this book actually pushes, no, is seen in terms, or at least the NSP can be seen in terms of, no, South Korea trying to expand, no, the scope of its soft power, no, and public diplomacy. Okay, but beyond that, no, is the idea that supporting ASEAN actually extends the scope within which soft power and public diplomacy from Korea, no, gains, no, a broader set of or a larger venue, no, for exercise, no. And in this context, no, the peace component of South Korea's new Southern policy is very much directed at maintaining and even strengthening support for the existing regional security architecture, and consequently for ASEAN centrality. This is clear in the ASEAN-South Korea strategic partnership, no, which provided the aspirational basis for cooperation and, no, political security, and on political security matters. No, there is now a plan of action, no, that goes beyond 2016 and 2020, no, and this has an extends, no, from 2021 onwards, no. South Korea has committed itself not only to strengthening these regional mechanisms, no, but more importantly, no, actually extending those mechanisms in terms of their operational potentials, no. This has been one of the criticisms leveled at ASEAN, that much of its much of the initiatives that it actually tries to introduce now into the region, tends to be of an aspirational uh, uh, nature rather than an operational one. In other words, countries around the region tend to be left to their own devices as to how they're going to work within uh, 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 um, uh, the framing that ASEAN actually makes of its conditions. Nonetheless, South Korea has actually, and in this context, the South Korean commitment is not only to the aspirational aspect of it, but also to the operational aspect of it. In other words, pushing initiatives, specific initiatives to actually help put meat, so to speak, to the initiatives of ASEAN. Now, what I've actually talked about is the idea that Korea-ASEAN coordination and cooperation is seen in terms of the idea of maintaining the existing regional architecture, maintaining or even strengthening the ASEAN-led multilateral arrangements that we have across the region. And in that sense, supporting and strengthening ASEAN centrality. The question that has to be taken into consideration, and this has to do with now addressing the elephant in the room. That is to say that, going back to my initial question, right? We have the COVID pandemic, bedeviling the region. To what extent has it actually changed the context of the region? And I think that is where the irony actually comes in. I mentioned earlier on, that health, pandemics in particular, are seen as an opportunity for countries across the region to actually strengthen cooperation, right? To come up with um, common approaches, to how to actually address the issue. No? The interesting thing about the COVID-19 situation is that there is an unseen consequence of the pandemic, but that 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 unseen, or let's put it this way, an unexpected, the unexpected consequence of the pandemic is interesting precisely because it comes in together with or maybe because of what I mentioned as the elephant in the room. That is to say that amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, there is the increasing intensification of the competition between the United States and China, right? And going back to my question earlier on, how has COVID-19 actually changed the strategic calculus across the region? And what we can actually see here is that um, that competition between China and the United States had been in place, even before the pandemic actually struck the region, right? And amidst the effects of the pandemic has continued to actually escalate and intensify, right? At the ASEAN, the 53rd ASEAN Day commemoration on August 8, 2020, um, in his keynote speech, Vietnamese Foreign Minister Pham Minh was actually uh, uh, um, hinting at this particular point when he actually said that one of the things that the region actually that ASEAN has to confront is the new dynamism in the geostrategic landscape. I'm not sure to what extent you can talk about it as being new, right? I think that dynamism in the geostrategic landscape is something that has been growing over time. Meaning to say that this is not to say that there's a certain inevitability to it. The way that a number of uh, um, scholars have actually pointed to it. Graham and Allison's uh, um, treatise on the Thucydides trap, for instance, is important in terms of or illustrating how there's this tendency to understand the relationship between China and the United States as something that's inevitable, right? That the competition, the strategic rivalry, is something that comes out of the nature of power, in the international system, right? And if we understand it that way, then this new dynamism, that Foreign Minister Fan was actually pointing to, was something that was in fact building, over the past few decades already, as China embarked uh, on its peaceful growth, and of course the inevitability that its expansion as an economic power and eventually a political power within the region would put it in a position of confrontation with the United States. Okay. um the foreign minister of Indonesia, Her Excellency Retno Marsudi, was actually much more explicit about it. Okay, the Vietnamese foreign minister was still very much reticent, about naming names, and identifying the issue, but Ambassador Foreign Minister Marsudi actually pointed out that what we are really seeing as an issue across the region is the intensification of great power rivalries. Okay. Um, and this is where I think, and she added a number of things in her statement, which I think goes back to what I was saying earlier on, that with the intensification of great power rivalry, we also see, no, excuse me, uh, uh, a de-emphasizing of the importance of cooperation, right? And beyond the emphasizing cooperation, no, is a the emphasizing of the importance, no, of multilateral arrangements, no, which have been key to the kind of architecture that we actually have, you know, around the region. So, in other words, what is interesting here is the way that uh, we see within ASEAN an increasing recognition, no, of how this competition between China and the United States, no, is shaping the nature of that strategic environment that we're actually facing. That strategic environment which Korean cooperation with ASEAN is supposed to maintain, no, is supposed to strengthen, and is supposed to sustain, no, um, uh, uh, to continue to continue to emphasize, no, the virtue of cooperation, no, and the importance of multilateral arrangements, no, to the way that we've actually been maintaining regional security and stability, right? So in other words, in that context, no, you have on one hand, no, Korea ASEAN cooperation directed at maintaining, no, the current regional architecture, no. But the question that actually comes to mind is the extent to which that effort, no, can actually balance, no, or perhaps or balance the intensifying competition between the United States and China, right? No. Um, in June 2020, no, the ASEAN leaders actually came out with a vision statement, okay, where it reaffirmed, no, and again, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier on, no, the increasing importance, no, as far as ASEAN is concerned, no, and therefore the support provided by Korea to that, no, of asserting, no, international law as a framework, as a foundation, no, for continued international relationships, no, as far as the as far as Southeast Asia is actually concerned, no, and within that context, no, promoting peace, security, stability, safety, and freedom of navigation and overflights above the South China Sea. Now, this is not a statement that you would have found in earlier ASEAN statements. No, so what you can see now is is an increasing recognition, no, of the importance of the maritime domain, an increasing recognition, no, of the centrality of the South China Sea within that maritime domain, and the extent to which issues concerning the South China Sea might actually contribute to a diminishing, no, of the sense of security and stability across the region. Okay, and so what we actually find here, no, is a reaffirmation on the part of ASEAN, and by extension, no, the support provided by Korea to the continued importance of cooperation, of multilateralism, no, and international law, right? As far as these issues are actually concerned, right? This is a picture of that uh, overlapping, no, interlocking arrangements that you actually have across the region, no, which ASEAN, no, continues to emphasize, no, and within which, no, ASEAN continues to assert, no, the idea of ASEAN centrality. Okay, it is this architecture to a large extent, no, that Korea actually supports, no, and within the context of its cooperation with ASEAN, within the context of the new Southern policy, especially with regards to the pillar on peace, no, this is the mechanism which Korea believes, no, is instrumental to maintaining peace across the region. Okay. Now the problem is this, no, and I think I've hinted at it, no. Um, First of all, is the actual sustainability of ASEAN centrality, no. Why is that? There are two issues here that need to be taken into consideration. The first one has to do with the idea that ASEAN centrality is primarily seen in terms of, no, ASEAN's relationship with its dialogue partners, meaning to say that ASEAN centrality in the context of, no, this interlocking set of relationships, no, that involves ASEAN with its dialogue partners, no, and of course the other countries in the region, whether or not they are dialogue partners of ASEAN, but nonetheless in a continuing interaction with each other. Okay. Um, what you can actually see here, no, is the idea that um, that kind of centrality that ASEAN actually plays, no, works on two things. Okay, number one is the extent to which ASEAN actually maintains its solidarity. In fact, one of the interesting things about many of the statements that has come out of ASEAN, okay, and is implied in the many statements that ASEAN and Korea actually talk about, no, as far as the security arrangements are actually concerned, no, has to do with the idea of the importance or maintaining the importance, no, of ASEAN cohesiveness, right? And to a large extent, no, what I pointed to earlier on, okay, in terms of the increasing and intensifying rivalry between the United States and China is important not just because of the extent to which that rivalry threatens to actually overwhelm the region, no, but the extent to which that rivalry is also seen, no, in terms of how both China and the United States, no, are pushing countries across the region, no, to actually identifying themselves in terms of their relationships, right? In other words, while not explicitly forcing them to choose sides, no, the relationship between China and the United States is actually forcing, no, countries across the region to actually express their preferences in terms of their relations with both China and the United States. Within ASEAN, no, there is a continuing or at least an expressed preference, no, for a continuing hedging strategy, meaning to say that it's neither China nor the United States, right? There's a preference for actually not choosing sides, okay? But it's very difficult to actually maintain that kind of position, no, in a situation where one or the other, no, is a predominant partner, no, on social, cultural, no, as well as political matters, right? So in that kind of context, no, within ASEAN, the assumption of ASEAN centrality actually hinges on the ability of ASEAN to maintain its solidarity, its cohesiveness, no, in the face of these changes that are actually taking place across the region. No, the problem is that within ASEAN, the different ASEAN states actually find themselves in a position where they're being forced to take sides, right? Some countries are too close to China as far as their economics are actually concerned. Others are politically much more comfortable with the United States, and so that kind of duality, so to speak, no, in how the ASEAN states actually deal with both China and the United States, no, makes it very difficult for ASEAN to actually speak with one voice across, no, across all issues, particularly issues that have to do with the strategic environment, right? So in that context, the question is, you know, to what extent can we actually still talk about ASEAN centrality, both at the level of number one, ASEAN dealing with its dialogue partners, and number two, the ASEAN states dealing with each other, in this context. In other words, ASEAN centrality actually has to deal with two things, right? ASEAN centrality as far as the region is concerned, and ASEAN centrality as far as the policies of its own members are actually concerned. Meaning to say that ASEAN centrality, more importantly, should be seen in terms of how the ASEAN states actually see ASEAN as being central to their own foreign policy. Okay, so in that sense, the sustainability of ASEAN centrality is a key concern, and therefore something that South Korea actually has to deal with, in terms of its own attempts to act to strengthen the regional architecture as it actually exists right now. Okay, because the sustainability of the existing architecture is anchored on ASEAN-driven multilateral arrangements, which hinges on ASEAN centrality, right? So if ASEAN centrality is a key concern, then the ability of those ASEAN-driven multilateral arrangements to maintain the regional architecture, okay, is in itself held hostage to the inability of ASEAN to sustain or to the question of how to sustain ASEAN centrality, right? So the success of the existing framework for regional security is to a large extent premised on the willingness of both now China and the United States to continue acceding to regional arrangements, and the decisions that are actually associated with them. And I think you can see how this is actually working out across the region, and to a large extent is the reason why we go back to the question of how sustainable is ASEAN centrality. Okay, and to a large extent, and the last the two bullet points here, actually has to do with, or at least implies, that the intensification of that rivalry between the United States and China, has very much something to do not just with things that are going on within the region, right, but things that are actually going on in the domestic context of both the United States and China, right? In the United States, this is being played out in the open. You have the election that's actually coming up in a few weeks, and the extent to which the Trump administration, has fundamentally transformed, the dynamics of regional cooperation. Right, America First has become a rallying cry for domestic support for Trump's foreign policy, but is dangerously a death knell for cooperation across the region. Right? If the United States abandons its a well-established role of honest broker, so to speak, within across the region, then to a large extent, it's going to be very difficult to actually sustain a regional architecture that is premised on the willingness of those involved in it to cooperate with one another. Okay, but it's not just the United States. China itself is also actually engaged in its own domestic dynamics. Right, a few years back, nobody would actually be imagining that when Xi Jinping was actually granted all or given or was able to actually concentrate power in his personality, that there would be any reason to actually think of any domestic challenges to Xi Jinping. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a space within which there is reason to be critical of the leadership of Xi Jinping. No, of course, to a large extent, this is something less evident. No, it's not like in the United States how things are actually being played out in the open, but nonetheless, it's an uncertainty, that also contributes to the continuing unpredictability, across the region. So, in other words, the idea of Korea actually supporting ASEAN and the idea of sustaining Korea ASEAN cooperation, which is at the center of the New Southern Policy, is premised very much on the idea that, or at least the notion that ASEAN will continue to play this very important role, as far as maintaining security, and stability across the region is concerned. Not only because of economic cooperation, and social exchanges, but that it can actually play an important political role, a diplomatic role at the very least, but issues with ASEAN centrality, and its ability to actually face up to the ravages, if you will, of this intensifying competition between China and the United States, makes or raises questions about the sustainability, of the existing regional architecture, and the notion, of ASEAN, and therefore ASEAN-led multilateralism, as a safe driver of regional security. And so the question here is, at least for South Korea, is the extent to which, how much does it still believe in ASEAN, and ASEAN-led multilateral arrangements, and the existing regional security architecture, okay, so that it will continue to play this notion of a middle power, or continue playing this role as a middle power, sustaining and supporting ASEAN, as some sort of balance, to the dynamic, that we see between China and the United States, which is increasingly dominating, the strategic environment, that we actually live in. Okay, so with that, thank you very much. I will stop here, and I welcome question that might actually come in during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kraft, for your very comprehensive and insightful presentation. I see that we have a lot of questions coming up already in our YouTube chat group, so keep them coming. We will be consolidating them by the end of the session during the open forum. So now we will proceed to our second speaker. So our second speaker for today is a professor of business administration of the Virata School of Business at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is also currently a principal investigator for UPKRC. He has written publications focusing on e-commerce, social media usage, big data analytics, supply chain management, and Hallyu studies, or also known as Hallyu, or also known as Green Wave. He earned his doctoral degree in international management from National Cheng Kung University in Taiwan. So to deliver his presentation entitled From K-pop to Basketball, Sustaining Diplomatic Efforts Through Entertainment and Sports, let us all welcome Dr. Erik Paulo Capistrano. Dr. Capistrano, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So let me share my screen a bit. All right, so good afternoon to everyone. So my task for this afternoon will be focusing on the on a more on a smaller part of the world, and this is basically just on North Korea and South Korea. So uh, probably for those of you who are here for first time and then wondering what has my background has to do with the topic this afternoon, it's really about using soft power as a means to try to enhance relations between two countries with two different ideals. So that being said, let's frame today's talk into two questions. And the first one is, what is the respective roles of Hallyu and South Korea's soft power strategies towards North Korean relations? And second, what are the respective opportunities in Hallyu and in sports that can be exploited to enhance the present efforts towards North Korean relations? So again, as I said, we will be focusing on just the Korean Peninsula here. So, but I will have some thoughts to throw at you guys regarding what are perceptions on this as well, vis-a-vis how Korea uses that soft power outside the peninsula. So, just for the agenda for this afternoon, I will be framing my talk into these 4 points. So, we start first with a discussion of relevant events and what actually triggered the renewed interest in the use of these two resources, soft power resources. So in 2018 was a very interesting year for the peninsula because there were three major events that triggered a renewed interest in North-South Korean relations. The first one was in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, wherein North Korea actually agreed to participate in the games. That being said, North and South Korea paraded together at the opening ceremony as a unified Korea, as you can see in the background picture there. And they actually fielded a unified team in women's ice hockey for the Olympics. A few months later, as a prelude to talks between national government leaders, Pyongyang hosted a Spring is Coming concert, which happened over 3 days. On April 1st and April 3rd, it was a more of a music type of concert, whereas on the April 2nd, it was a taekwondo exhibition. I will be touching on that in a little while. So there was a South Korean contingent led by Choi Yong-pil, Lee Seung-hee, Paek Chi-young, Choi Ji-ji, Red Velvet, and Son Yoshide Son, which performed alongside North Korean singers in Pyongyang. The most important part of this was that based on numerous reports, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, according to South Korean media, actually made time for this event. So he was in attendance, and there were several photo ops after the show that had him actually shaking hands with members of Red Velvet. So for a lot of observers, this was a very significant event to actually having Kim Jong-un in attendance in this said event. The third one is in the Asian Games, which was held in Jakarta from August to September, in which again North and South Korea fielded a unified team for some events under the title Korea. So what you're seeing right now is the flag that they were actually carrying during the Asian Games. So more importantly as well would be they actually won medals in some events, and that included gold and bronze in canoeing and silver in basketball. So for the Filipinos out there, we know how much Korea is a tormentor for our Philippine team. So and again they've proven their mettle during the Asian Games here. So these are the three significant events that actually triggered the way that we are seeing how other aspects of South Korea's soft power resources are being used and towards trying to warm up to North Korea all the more. However, these are not the only events that happened, but it just so happened that these were the ones that took a lot of spotlight, garnered a lot of the attention. Other notable events were more revolving about the development of taekwondo in the peninsula. So even as in at least in recent times, 2014, that the Taekwondo federations of both North and South Korea actually signed a protocol of accord to facilitate the exchanges, and this resulted in some significant events. For example, in 2015, during the World Taekwondo Championships in Russia, they held a joint performance as part of the ceremonies there. In 2018, during the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, they fielded a team as well to have an exhibition during the opening ceremonies. Furthermore, later during that year, when South Korea was the host for the World Taekwondo Championships, the North Koreans sent a demonstration team there as well. Then other ones were other joint performances were held during the same year, and this resulted into now initial talks wherein they are planning to actually integrate the sport to across the two federations, and experimenting on, let's say, the South Korean team will be competing under North Korean rules and vice versa. So these were like some of the more promising developments that we see here, and later on I will be explaining a little bit as to why this is an interesting point as well. Now, but of course, we need to frame the issue in the case of the soft power resources, because especially for us who are outside of the Korean Peninsula, we have a slightly different understanding on how these soft power resources are employed. So first of all, we will be looking at the perennial application of Hallyu as a soft power resource. This has been discussed time and again across several different studies, as you can see here. But in an outside the peninsula, it was more all about promoting its brand image and its ideologies. It is a powerful tour, granted, because it is populated by celebrities who have much influence over several types of audiences, and they become role models, they become opinion leaders, and they become ambassadors of brands, movements, advocacies, and ideologies. So from a global perspective, we see a lot of this happening through fans, through product endorsements, through increased awareness, increased promotions, very significant promotions all across the world. However, when we frame it in the context of North Korea, we also see a lot of anecdotal evidences of South Korean cultural media making its way into many sectors of North Korea. Now, if these reports are accurate, have been accurate in their descriptions, actually some underground movements that were happening in some sectors of North Korean society. For instance, the fashion that was popularized by Sonyeoside actually became an underground trend in some sectors of North Korea. But what is more interesting there is that there were also some feedback wherein some North Koreans find K-pop as refreshing, relatable, and liberating. But one of the funnier but still very interesting anecdotes that were reported was that reports of Halyu's influence on even North Korean housing prices, wherein some North Korean real estate agents would actually price housing units in area higher in areas wherein signals from South Korean broadcast media can be captured. So it's like you can pay higher this particular housing complex because you can watch KBS or MBC or SBS or whatever South Korean media is there. So those are some of the interesting aspects that we can see as a employing the soft power resource as far as Hallyu is concerned. Now, this is of course on top of the usual things that we've seen wherein all across the DMZ prior to them being dismantled earlier this year and late last year, wherein the South Korean military would be blasting K-pop songs such as Big Bang's Bang 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 and Sonyeoside's Suwal Nol Mareba to across the towards the North Korean side. So these are the more like the more subtle things that were happening and were reported along the border. So some of the points that we will raise regarding Hallyu as a soft power resource would be if we use it as a means of we see it as a means to improve North Korean relations, it should be seen more as an instinctive move, since it is more likely to attract people and steer soft power more favorably in context where the countries are culturally similar. So that's a key word, culturally similar. We need to understand how it's being used and how it should be used properly. The thing is, right now, we could also see the utilization of Hallyu towards North Korea that could fall more of a passive and indirect soft power rather than something that's proactive and strategic. Now, the problem also would be more on the overall use of the soft power strategy of Hallyu because of some of that broad ideological confrontation designed to counteract the North Korean propaganda. As I mentioned a while ago, one of the concrete examples here was when the time when those speakers were still active and they were blasting K-pop songs all across the DMZ. So that's more of a counteracting to North Korean propaganda. Now, sports are more interesting thing as far as soft power resources are concerned, because it has a very long history, even dating back to the Olympic Games during the Greek city-states era, where it is more importantly trade, commerce, and tourism flourished, and peace treaties and alliances were negotiated and formed. Now, there are several historical documentations and accounts of it, where even during the Peloponnesian Wars, Sparta was heavily fined by the Greek city-states for violating the truce during the Olympic Games. So it was that powerful, and we can see sports being used there as a means to try to negotiate, try to normalize and relations between city-states at that time. But of course, history has been also been full of so many different examples. So aside from that, in 1956 and in 1960, East and West Germany participated as a combined team under a common flag and a national anthem. And of course, the more also one of the more popular ones would be the ping pong diplomacy, in which the United States and the People's Republic of China had in 1971 as well. So it was also perceived not only between two as a relations between two countries, but also between two ideologies as well. Now, if you remember the movie Forrest Gump, there was a section there wherein this was really highlighted, and the ping pong, the table tennis aspect there was really employed in terms of how the United States and the People's Republic of China can have closer and warmer relations with each other. Now, more recently, let's say during also would be in the 1970s and the 80s, and also spilling over to the 90s, intra-Yemen football matches between North and South Yemen were also looked into, and eventually leading to amicable relations and unification in the 90s. So this was something also that's very interesting, the use of football as a means to really get ideologies and societies together. Also, speaking of football, if you remember the 2002 FIFA World Cup, wherein it was co-hosted by Japan and South Korea, this actually brought historically old enemies together, even if it's a temporary arrangement. But the thing is that we have to appreciate the fact that FIFA World Cup is one of the biggest, if not the biggest sporting events in the world, rivaling the Olympics. So because of that, the impact of all of these different examples of using sports as a soft power resource has also gained interest, especially these recent times. So some of the points I would also like to raise as far as sports is being concerned, it's like some of the more interesting about it would be the ideal setting wherein sports is ought to be entirely apolitical and therefore a perfect tool for diplomacy. But we see that sports now is being used to further political agendas. More recent, just to give a brief background on it, you're right, Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling in the national anthem during the National Football League games in America is one of the most recent, if not more, and powerful examples wherein sports has been used to further political agendas. Now we see a lot of the American leagues, like in the National Basketball Association, in the National Football League, in Major League, wherein athletes are making statements to support Black Lives Matter. We've seen the reigning champion Naomi Osaka in the recently concluded U.S. Open, wherein she actually wore face masks with the names of victims of police violence. So we now see growing attention to sports being used to further such political agendas. But the thing is also, sports is filled with many nationalistic symbols and actions, and therefore some degree of national identity and pride as well. And what actually amplifies interest in sports as a soft power tool is the fact that it's widely covered in media, both in the domestic, the national, and then even at the international levels. Sports are covered by all sorts of media and therefore exposed to the general public. And also, sports is one of the most interesting arenas in terms of its stakeholders. We see individual players, we see sports clubs and organizations, even entire leagues and associations and governing bodies. As we've seen in the Korean example with Taekwondo, all getting together and having their inputs regarding sports as a venue to further diplomatic efforts. Okay. But not to mention also sports sponsors and investors are also making statements as well. So there's a lot of different examples that we can see here, where in sports is something that makes a lot of interest as far as it being a soft power resource is concerned. Now, the next part of will be some of the commentaries that we can look into as far as using Hallyu in sports is concerned. Now, there were several surveys made by Gallup Korea, for instance, wherein we see some of the reasons for the necessity of the unification with North and South, with North Korea as follows. So we can see on this diagram here that a lot of them believe that because we are in the same ethnic group, so that's why we need to pursue unification. And the second one is to eliminate the threat of war between the two Koreas. So we know by now that technically it's just a ceasefire, it's just a truce. They haven't actually formally ended the Korean War. So those are the main reasons why. And then whether or not the participation of North Korea in Pyeongchang Winter Olympics would affect. So there's a strong belief, as reported by the Hyundai Research Institute, wherein this would positively affect present efforts to have a better relations with North Korea as well. Yeah. So, and then what do other opinions about it, other concerns about it would be more on what are the solutions to the North Korean nuclear weapon and missile development programs. It's all about talks and sanctions. That's what all they're saying. Okay. And then the major agendas between the Koreas that South Korean according to South Korean experts would be all of this, let's say the relaunch of the six-party talks, the restart of the Mount Kumgang tourism, the reoperation of the Quezon Industrial Complex, and the cancellation of the May 24 measures. So these are the top 4 issues and the agendas to which South Korean experts would like to see more being pushed to the table as far as talking to North Korea is concerned. And of course, getting all of this would also mean that there will be some feedback regarding what's the current performance or what's the current feedback towards these efforts to talk to North Korea. So this was in 2018. So as of February 2018, the general sentiment was good. So a lot of it here. Now the reason of me showing these graphs to us, to all of us, is that we need to think now if this is the thing, if these are the things in which South Koreans would like to see or are expecting or are thinking as far as talking to North Korea is concerned, then the question is, how does the use of Hallyu and sports, okay, reinforce and influence the success going forward to achieving these goals, or to achieving how much do they help in the nuclear weapons program, for instance? How much how can they further employ Hallyu and sports as soft power resources, so that later on from good it becomes very good as far as the policy performance perceptions are concerned. So those are the things that we need to think about, especially for us outsiders, that we perceive Hallyu and sports diplomacy in an entirely different manner. Now, some of the more of the qualitative statements made by officials would be, just to also reinforce this, would be as follows. So in some of the interviews after the Taekwondo exhibitions in the Spring is Coming concert was that some North Koreans are beginning to realize that Taekwondo is the same, regardless of where it is. There are slightly different differences in content, but they're essentially the same. But, and one of these differences would be South Korea is more towards on the musical storytelling side of performing, whereas in North Korea it's feel more like a practical martial arts focus, and then you can feel the strength in it. So this feedback is very valuable, especially moving forward, wherein later on, if and when the two federations do integrate with each other, then we can see some of this going forward as well. Now, some of the also commentary on present efforts, as some of this we need to see South and North relationship not as a competition between conservatives and progressives, but it's really about, some of them would really describe it as a life and death situation between the two Koreas. It's about the consciousness, security consciousness. It's all about keeping national identity, and so on and so forth. So these are the things that we want, or they also wish that they would see as we move forward. Now, there's also some talks from outside regarding it. Is it supposed to be a question of homogeneity versus heterogeneity? And then is it a question of how different or how similar South and North actually is, especially now? So those are some of the questions that we also need to ask. And if and also the problem also lies in terms of the urban and the rural distribution in North Korea and in South Korea. There's still a lot of suburban and rural areas in both countries, and there is some worry wherein if it comes to reunification, then it will be all centered in Seoul and Pyongyang, being urban cosmopolitan elite areas, and then the rest of the country will be left on its own. So it would somehow fail to actually foster a unified social order if these areas outside Seoul and Pyongyang would be left behind. So it just adds another layer of complexity to the way that we are looking at this situation, in which admittedly, as an outsider, we really don't see this, or at least we don't appreciate all of this right away. That only when we are in this situation more deeply, that we can appreciate that there are multiple layers and several different stakeholders that actually have a say in these efforts that we see. So in terms of where do we actually go from here, as far as laying all of this out is concerned. Okay. So some key takeaways to build on. Okay. Hallyu as a resource, in the 2018 Spring is Coming event, there was much fanfare and much positive impression to it, simply because of the warm reception from the North Korean audiences that they actually had there. The Spring is Coming concert was not the first one wherein K-pop stars performed in North Korea. In 2003, there was a concert also held in Pyongyang wherein big groups such as Shinhwa and Baby Vox, for those of you who remember first generation K-pop, okay, K-pop. But the thing is that audiences were reportedly silent and had stony impressions. The scarier part here was that there were some anecdotal evidences to actually say that they were actually told to do so. Like North Korean audiences were told to stay silent and remain expressionless all throughout the concerts. There was an interview with some of the members of Shinhwa recalling that experience as well, and they said that they felt really scared about performing during their performance because there was no feedback at all. Whereas during the Spring is Coming concert, the reception was, well, warmer. Okay, was warmer, and they were more receptive about it. Like I said, there was a lot of photo op after the program, and Kim Jong Un was posing with Red Velvet in order for the media to see and get disseminated all around the world. North Korean audiences were allowed access to popular representatives of what their government once branded as quote-unquote decadent capitalism. This is something also very powerful because there's a lot of commentary about K-pop, South Korea, okay, in South Korea and K-pop as an instrument of capitalism. And we know that in North Korea, the ideology is very different to that. They're really opposing capitalism. So for the likes of Red Velvet to perform in North Korea was something that's really very important. For those of you who recall that performance, there were some changes to the choreography. For instance, Kang Sul-gi, instead of doing the shotgun choreography during her performance, she changed it. Yeah, so there were still some subtle differences that were happening there as well. And but the thing is, like, Red Velvet in itself represented present day imagery and representations of what K-pop is, and it's really about opening up to the West, having it more globalized, and for them to actually perform their songs in North Korea is something that is very significant. Significant about it. Now, but the thing is, like, we can also look at the Hallyu as a resource, and some conscious decisions that are inherent there as well would be, there are some commentaries wherein members of the group were carefully selected to infuse cross-generational soft power. So, for instance, like I said, Red Velvet and Sohyun represented Hallyu's global popularity, but while the veterans were known and loved by the older generations. So there was this anchor in which like the older stars were representing what was good in the past, and like in the hopes that a lot of North Korean audiences can relate to that as well. However, one of the smarter things that they also said that they did during that concert was that the addition of rock and R&B to the concert, to the contingent, adding Yoon Do Hyun from the rock band YB and R&B singer Jongin showcased also the diversity of K-pop. It wasn't just about the K-pop that we knew. So it's showing that diversity added an extra layer of attractiveness, and also a signal to which this is what South Korea can offer, as opposed to what North Korean music was all about. So whether that's good or bad, that's another discussion altogether. But the mere fact that they were allowed access to that, North Korean audiences were allowed access to that, they got exposed into it, they were able to okay, they were able to, yeah, they were able to see all of these things, would be something that we could also look into as we go along, okay, as we go along here. Now, regarding sports, okay, sports utilization as a resource is to unify states with clashing ideologies has been an interesting subject for discussion. We've seen a lot of examples of this as we went along. The thing is that present efforts between North and South Korea will inevitably draw parallels to history, such as the case of Yemen and football. They were able to unite the country because of football, as some of the scholars would say. Or say in the mixed racial heritage of the 2014 FIFA World Cup United States football team. It was not purely American white team. There were a lot of different ethnic groups represented in that football team as well. But of course, we need to address some of the concerns. Okay? We need to address some of the concerns here. For instance, fans, a very significant group of stakeholders, are widely disapproving of these approaches. I remember distinctly during the talks we're in fielding a unified Korean team. Okay, fielding a unified Korean team, we see on Twitter some South Koreans seeing it no more as a political gimmick. So that was one of the things there that we see, and a lot of them were, especially sports fans, they were cynical about the representation that was seen there. So fans perceive sports diplomacy also as something sacrilegious because it deviates from what they believe sports is. Sports is supposed to be an entity set free by globalization, free from corruption and diverse divisive elements of politics and diplomacy. But we see nowadays that that's not true anymore. And there's a lot of different things that are really contentious about it. Like every time an athlete makes a political statement, audiences are always divided. Some of them would support, some of them just stay with sports, don't mix politics into it, and so on and so forth. So it being a powerful tool for diplomacy, it's also something that something that really needs further discourse about it as well. Now, another key takeaway to build on is the celebrities and athletes' role on this. So music and sports celebrities have no formal training, orientation, and disposition as demanded by formal diplomacy channels. That's the problem. They can be brand ambassadors, they can be a representatives of some advocacy, but for them to be in the same level or in the same environment as informal diplomatic channels, that is something that's still a little bit contentious about it, because celebrities are not limited on what and how they communicate and can therefore create controversies by going off script, despite being scrutinized by the public almost constantly. Take for example before with Tiger Woods. Before when the infidelity scandal came out before, a lot of his major endorsements terminated the contracts with him. So the point there would be, if it happens on a commercial environment wherein brands and companies can unilaterally drop athletes and if they're not aligned with the values or that they're promoting, what more for international relations? So there's a very big risk that's inherent when we get celebrities to become part of the diplomatic efforts there. So other questions that we want to raise here as well is that, is soft power the alternative in all to replace hard power, or it should be a means to introduce hard power? So that's one of the questions there. Do the present executions and applications of Hallyu and sports contribute to the efforts of the brand Korea and to North-South relations? So that's the other thing that we see here. So We know that's what's happening. We know what South Koreans want. The question is, does Hallyu and sports help in addressing these efforts that we see here? Okay. And lastly, okay, how will the international community react since the Korean reunification remains to be a hotly debated topic amongst the global powers? Professor Kraft mentioned China and the United States. They also have a stake in whether or not the Korean Peninsula will reunify or not. So how will now the international community react in these efforts? Okay? Like I said, presenting this, especially as with K-pop stars, with K-drama celebrities, we perceive them differently if they're being used as soft channels for Korea outside of the peninsula. But we see a large difference here that we see when it comes to the North Korean issue. Okay. So I hope that these questions, this presentation and these questions would further help us understand that it might take a different perspective for us to really push for whether sports and can be something that South Korea can continually use, especially now that talks have apparently stalled. It's because of some saber rattling and all of this right now. So, and since now everything is stalled, it might be a good opportunity for us to see whether or not this is something that we can actually recommend and push forward as the talks with North Korea is concerned. Okay. So with that, I hope that has been informative, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Capistrano, for your very informative and dynamic presentation. So I'd just like to remind everyone that you can continue to send your questions in the YouTube chat. So at this point, we are now very honored to have our esteemed discussants to share their reactions, thoughts, and perspectives on the topics presented by our speakers. So in the interest of time, may we request our discussants to limit their remarks to 10 minutes. So that's 10 minutes for our discussants for today. So our first discussant is an associate professor at the Asian Center of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His research interests include the political economy of the Middle East, security issues in the Persian Gulf, and terrorism. He received his doctoral degree in international relations from the University of Tehran. So ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our first discussant, Dr. Henelito Sevilla Jr. Dr. Sevilla, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miranda. And congratulations to the two speakers. I also would like to thank the UP Korean Research Center for inviting me here today to be one of the discussants on the third Philippine Koreanist Congress, Revisiting Diversity and Multiculturalism in Contemporary Korea. Now let's proceed to the first topic of the first presentation. I am so glad that Professor Kraft made mention about the importance of South Korean relations with the Association of the Southeast Asian Nation, particularly with regards to their economic and trade interactions. Professor Kpop made mention about the two-way trade between South Korea and ASEAN, which is estimated of about 160.5 billion in 2018. And then there is also an increasing degree of foreign direct investment, which is equivalent to 6.6%. And of course, in the the earlier part of this discussion of Professor Kraft, he made mention that South Korea is the fifth largest trading ASEAN in trading partner of the Association of the Southeast Asian Nation. Given this robust economic growth in the region, in the Southeast Asia as well as in the Northeast Asia, it would only mean that it would require for it to be sustainable in the future, this economic growth. It requires a stable and sustainable relative peace. And this is basically the concerns of many partners. The members of the Southeast Asian nations as well as the countries outside of the region. Now, I'm saying this because security really is very important for this sustainability. And if you look at the security environment of Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, we find different or several security nuances. No, one is the security issue in the South China Sea. We have the Korean Peninsula, and we have the East China Sea. And then to add on that is the issue of piracy and terrorism. And I'm so glad that Professor Kraft also mentioned the non-traditional security issues that we are facing today, the COVID-19 pandemic. That would basically push us to an argument or assumption that countries in the region may tend to cooperate. But the question to us is whether or not great power politics would bring this cooperation together and would bring different contending parties together in the table. Now, uh, another thing that we need to look at is the rise of China, no? In the security environment of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The rise of China is seen by a lot of us as very disturbing because it installed norms and mechanisms that are not familiar or not so much acceptable to many countries in the region. It offers an alternative model, such as the OBOR, the One Belt, One Road policy, and it even created or initiated the ASEAN Infrastructural Investment Bank. These basically are challenges or a new infrastructure that challenge the old infrastructure that has been installed by the Western countries. And then in the presentation also, Professor Kraft made mention about the possibility of having a division between and among member countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nation, given that China is economically influencing their policy, no, over the general regional interests of the member countries. Now let's proceed to the so-called centrality of ASEAN, no, the Association of the Southeast Asian Nation. The way I look at it, no other regional or organization or regional mechanism that are actually available in the region that may be able to manage efficiently regional conflicts and tension. From 1967, ASEAN has fostered unprecedented levels of regional economic, political, as well as security cooperation. And from ASEAN, we created different regional affiliated institutions, such as the ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Plus 1, ARF, East Asian Summit, ASEAN Defense Ministry Meeting. Now, it is very important to note that ASEAN helps to prevent bilateral differences from turning into major conflicts. However, ASEAN is also unable to resolve chronic maritime territorial claims involving powerful countries. The question to us when we bring in the Republic of Korea in the strategic landscape is, would the partnership between the Republic of Korea and ASEAN enough to move forward to create this viable security environment within the Southeast Asian region as well as the Northeast Asian region? Or would it require, or would these two powerful groups work within the ambit of the US alliance system? Okay, so we need to understand that the United States engaged Asia by creating network of security alliances. And if you go back to the Obama administration, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was actually a way of rebalancing the US policy vis-a-vis the Southeast Asia, then we would say that the United States is really keen on maintaining the so-called the freedom of navigation in the Southeast Asia. No, in the Southeast Asia, we have a very important narrow strait, which is the Malacca, as well as the Malacca Strait. No, which is between the Singapore, I think, and Malaysia. So these are actually important narrow strait that is very important in the freedom of navigation. But during the time of Trump administration, the Trump administration in 2017 withdrew from the TPP. No, that would actually brings the countries in Southeast Asia into asking a very important question of what would be the future direction of the security cooperation between these countries in the region. Trump administration or government offer the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. However, if you look at the literature written by a lot of scholars, you may find out that there is some hesitation from the Republic of Korea to basically fully engage in the Trump endorsement of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. If you look at also the 1917 quadrilateral security dialogue between the US, Japan, India, and Australia, South Korea was not there. No? Then it's the big question of why. And probably when probably internal and external factors can bring us or can guide us to explain why this reluctance on joining the Trans-Pacific project that Trump's administration was trying to propose. And one of this reason is basically the new South policy, which was promoted by President Moon's design in order for South Korea to have some sort of autonomy with regards to approaching the region. Domestic factors could be that in the 2017, that was the first year after the impeachment crisis of President Park Jin-hon, and therefore they are still more concentrated on the issue internally. And of course, President Moon's in 2017 was too occupied with the inter-Korean relationship, no, on how to fix them together. Now, the new South Korea was actually the new South policy of Korean government or the South Korean government, from my own understanding, would actually seek to diversify its economic and strategic option. And Professor Trump made mention about the support of South Korea under this new South policy on the ASEAN centrality, which give more emphasis on the centrality of the maritime domain. All right. Now, under the new South policy, there are actually a lot of initiatives which were spearheaded by the Moon's government. President Moon's visited all ASEAN countries, and he was the first among the South Korean president that visited all these countries, no, in Southeast Asia. And also in 2017, he hosted ASEAN presidents in Busan, which was actually mentioned by Professor Kraft in his presentation. However, it has to be cleared here that the issue on security political consideration is lagging far behind as compared to socio-cultural cooperation. Professor Trump made mention about the underthought on the issue of security cooperation. Now, with all this, I would like to pose these questions. Number one is the reluctance of the Republic of Korea to approach Trump's free and open Trans-Pacific strategy, which was in 2017, and the non-joining of the Republic of Korea to the quadrilateral dialogue in 2007, a smart and calculated decision of South Korea based on INSP, which emphasized conflict avoidance strategy, particularly in dealing with China. The second question that I would like to ask is that the central issue, I would like to ask what is Professor Trump's take on this, that the central issue on INSP or the new Southern policy is to really identify what policy does and what role can Republic of Korea play in the management of security nuances in the Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. The third question is ASEAN Republic of Korea security partnership in the future outside the ambit of the US alliance system in addressing security challenges in the region feasible in the future? It's a question of sustainability. And lastly is, how can ASEAN help in the management of security environment in the Korean Peninsula, as well as in its East China Sea? Thank you very much. The second would be the presentation of Professor Capistrano. I'm not so familiar with Hallyu, but I would like to say that Kpop and sports are both self-resources, and if utilized properly by state, it can give and add on to the soft power of the state, like the case of South Korea. Now, soft power from the definition of Joseph Nee says that it is the ability of a country or group of people to attract and to bring other countries, no, to be with them in association without resorting to force or coercion or punishment. So given this, the experience of South Korea in Kpop is a very good it's a very good uh, example of how soft power or cultural aspect of soft power can bridge one particular country with another particular country and can bring in positive image and opinion to that particular country that promotes the idea of soft power. And then you speak about from subculture to sport diplomacy, which is basketball. No, sports is clearly part of the cultural diplomacy. It transcends physical boundary of the state as well as cultural differences. No, as you made mention in the ancient time, there was a Peloponnesian War where Greek utilized the so-called Olympic truce to basically bring contending parties to to bring them together in sports and not engaging more in war. But and also in 1993 at the UN General Assembly, uh, the so-called Olympic truce was actually revived, no, as an instrument of diplomacy, and therefore your study is very important. No, it's very important to look into the details and how this sports and pop culture can really establish and promote or strengthen diplomatic ties between countries as well as countries that are not incongruent with each other, no, like the North and South Korea. Now, the question that I would like to pose here to Professor Capistrano is, if we consider sports as one language of diplomacy, can everyone expect a long-lasting effect of this form of diplomacy, especially between the contending parties? Because you made mention that sports diplomacy is somehow a political and not political. But in the case of Korea, South and North Korea, or even in the case of US and China, or US and Iran, I think political solution is very important. So I would like to look into the possibility of employing sports diplomacy as a great diplomatic tool to basically uh, enhance, better, strengthen diplomatic cooperation between and among contending parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sevilla, for your thought-provoking comments. So we will now proceed with our second discussant. So our second discussant for today is currently the Project Director for Public Diplomacy at KlangPanya Institute for National Strategies in Thailand. He previously served as the coordinator for on the ASEAN Roundtable in Seoul National University and a senior editor of the Seoul National University Journal of International Affairs. He has written articles and book chapters on ASEAN-Korean relations and South Korean public diplomacy. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our second discussant, Mr. Seksan Anantasirikiat. The floor is yours, Mr. Seksan.
All right. Selamat po, sawadee krap. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Mr. Anton, Miranda. First of all, I would like to congratulate the UP Korea Research Center for initiating this great event, as you are playing a bigger role in promoting Korean studies in the region, and also the two presenters for sharing your insightful and useful presentations with us. I have the point to share with the two presentations, and I will start first with the first presentation by Professor Herman. We are now living in a kind of let's say, very important period as we are facing the competition between US and China. And also, as Professor Herman explained, the US, China, Korea, even Korea, ASEAN, ROK relations are really important to help all of us ASEAN member countries to go through this very important period. Many media and scholars mention about the US-China competition in many dimensions, like trade war and tech war. But I would emphasize that there will be another war on ideology. It's a war to influence the foreign publics to take side. As you might have heard about the Milk Tea Alliance happening in Thailand, that some of our younger generations promote or prefer Hong Kong over over China. So this can be a kind of our challenge as the state and the people are diverging. So national interests are kind of being challenged in this kind of context. And that's why I would say that soft power and public diplomacy has played a very important role in, let's say, maintaining and sustaining national interest, and also promoting healthy relations between ASEAN and ROK, ASEAN and great powers, including US and China. May I share some of the results that I take part in a research team under the Ministry of Commerce of Thailand? We see that the future of the New World Order, we call it New World Order, we see the US is declining as you see President Trump tries to put forth the US first and left many national stages. And also we see the rise of China as our discussants and the presenters mentioned. So this is a kind of the situation now, but China is not ready to be the global leader. That's why we need South Korea and Japan and India and even ASEAN ever more. So this kind of the situation that we see, especially the Thai scholars and some of the Thai officials. All right, so now I will go to the second presentation by Dr. Erik. And I would say that Dr. Erik has mentioned two important points in his presentation. First, this presentation is very interesting because it focuses on one missing issue, especially the role of soft power resources in promoting North and South relations. And the second, the presentation focuses more on entertainment and sports as resources that could play an important role in building a sustainable relationship. And I really like the word sustainability and sustainable we discussed today in both presentations, because COVID makes us think about to survive in short-term period, but in longer term, we should be sustained as well. And I have some points to share with the Professor Erik as well. First, I see that the soft power has some limitations in bridging North and South Korea, as Professor already mentioned. It seems that the use of entertainment and sports by the South Korean government focuses mainly on to build the popularity, but has no strategic ambition or strategic, let's say, objective behind the actions. This is very different from the conservative government under Park Geun-hye and also under Lee Myung-bak. As we can see that the conservative, earlier this year, the conservative group tried to, let's say, put the balloon into North Korean boundaries to promote K-pop, right? That's I think there is a kind of the strategic objective behind this action, although it makes Korean inter-Korean relations worse, but it has some kind of strategic objective. Try to make North Korean people criticize more about the government, and maybe they expect some kind of regime change. So this is a kind of what I see, because we did not see that these soft power resources would lead to behavioral change of North Korean state at all. That's my first assumption. And the second point is the domestic issues in South Korea itself, because in South Korean politics, there is a word nam nam galtung. It means like South divide. There is a great divide, conservative and the progressive, and especially President Moon's government, he emphasizes more on cultural issues and also cooperation rather than kind of the hawkish approach, very different from the previous government. But he also received criticisms, big criticisms from the Korean people, especially the recent circumstance that a fisherman was killed by North Korean officials. I think this made me think about the Professor Egan's concept on soft power synergy and soft power dilemma. Professor Egan, he's now the president of Korea Foundation, our sponsor today, right? He coined the term soft power synergy and soft power dilemma, which means soft power will be successful when the two factors, the international factors and domestic factors converge. And he made the case of the six-party talks. I mean, the role of six-party talks played by China as a successful case, and the Japan's unsuccessful because like Japan always raised the issue about the abductees at the six-party talks. So that's why Japan always failed for that. So this kind of the two factors that play an important role in making this issue successful. And I would have some further points to discuss. First, when we focus on the role of soft power in maintaining the inter-Korean relations, I would say that it should not be Korea who play this role, because Korea has limitations and Korea has to manage international situations and also domestic situations. As we can see that I would say that maybe Kim Jong-un, he did not buy soft power resource by South Korea, but he just have some plans. Because in December 2017, we still see the 6th nuclear test, which is the biggest one. But on the New Year address, Kim Jong-un changed his kind of behavior immediately to welcome any kind of cooperation and kind of assistance from South Korea. So it's kind of a little bit strategic. I would say that North Korea has been playing a strategic card over South Korea, but South Korea maybe, I mean, from my perspective, is too naive, let's say, to play this kind of the soft power card towards North Korea. So I would say that ASEAN should play this role, soft power resource of ASEAN. ASEAN has many soft power resources, as we have discussed in many conferences these days. Yesterday, there was a conference organized by NUS, and a professor talked about characteristics of ASEAN that conducive and attractive to North Korea, such as Singapore's and Vietnam's economic development, and the role of ASEAN in inviting North Korea to join ARF, and some kind of the trade relations between North Korea and some ASEAN countries. So this is what I think that ASEAN can play a very key role in promoting soft power to promote the relationship between North and South Korea, and also North Korea and the Korean Peninsula issue. And second point, what kind of contents or what kind of the issues that we should put forward? I think Professor Erik has mentioned very clearly, and I really like his realization of the limitations of the soft power resource, that sports and entertainment have limitations, especially like stakeholder and like multi-stakeholder, and fans. How can they manage fans? Sometimes there would be conflict of interest. So this is a big issue that it could not lead to a successful result. But I would like to hear more from Professor Erik about how can these soft power resources play a role in sustaining the relationship, as mentioned in the topic of the presentation, because this is very important, and I could say that it could lead to any progressive development in strengthening ASEAN-ROK relations, and also a greater role of ASEAN in promoting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seksan, for your enlightening remarks. So I believe our discussants have raised very interesting questions to our speakers. So we will now proceed with the open forum. Unfortunately, since we have limited time, we can only accommodate a very few questions from our audience. So we would like our speakers to answer or to give counter reactions to our discussants. Please be mindful that we can only allot 3 minutes for each speaker to respond to our reactors. So let's start first with Professor Kraft. If you have counter reactions to the points made by our discussants.
Yeah. Thank you, Anton, and thank you, Seksan and June, for your questions. June actually asked for 4 questions, or there were 4 points that that he asked me to actually respond to, and all of them actually has to do with the Korean side of the equation as far as Korea-ASEAN relations is actually concerned. Um, the calculations actually, and I think this boils down to the calculations being made by South Korea, within the context of everything that's actually going on. Is the non-participation in the in the free and open Indo-Pacific and the Quad calculated? No, in other words, is this something that's actually being done in juxtaposition with the issue of the NSP? In other words, go with the NSP, there's no need for the FOIP and the Quad, right? But there's also one thing that has to be taken into consideration. I think South Korea has lost. Let's put it this way: they're not too happy with the Trump administration, right? The way that the Trump administration has basically transformed the relationship between especially the security relationship between South Korea and the United States, into a transactional relationship, right? Involving an increase in the amount of money that South Korea is contributing to the bases, and to the alliance itself. I think South Korea is not adverse to the idea of increasing its share, but the way that the Trump administration did it was not exactly something that that they found reinforced their sense of being with the United States. So I suspect that there's that aspect to the relationship. No, it's not just using the NSP as a way of an alternative to the FOIP, no, but also just this notion that the Trump administration is not a good partner, as far or a reliable partner in this particular context, no. And so this brings us to the question of does the NSP then create, or at least within that context, is there an imagined role for the Republic of Korea as far as the region is actually concerned? And I think this goes back to what I was saying about the middle power ship, or the status of being a middle power that comes into this, right? The Republic of Korea sees itself in cooperation with ASEAN as a bulwark, so to speak, against the disruptive nature of the competition between China and the United States. Unfortunately, the question is whether it's enough, right? This question of this, and I think Seksan was actually pointing to that as well, right? The question of can Korea and ASEAN, and maybe with other partners, prove to be strong enough as a bulwark, to prevent the overwhelming or the competition between China and the United States, to basically overwhelm the status that we have right now. And I think that's the big question, right? And my suspicion is that given the situation of ASEAN, that's probably not going to happen in that sense. Again, I think ASEAN is only strong to the extent that it remains cohesive, right? Especially in terms of maintaining a common position in terms of the relationship with China and the United States. The moment the ASEAN member countries go their own way as far as the relationship is with the two superpowers that are concerned, then I think that weakens ASEAN and weakens the position of Korea as well. No, so in this context, I think right now you can actually say that yes, ROK ASEAN cooperation might still see itself within the ambit of what is traditionally the traditional U.S. strategic standpoint, right? I think the problem for everyone is with Trump as president, and the Trump administration in charge of the United States, we're not really too sure to what extent we can actually expect the United States to adhere to what has been, or what we expect, or what we have come to expect of it, right? In past time. So that unpredictability that the Trump administration has actually brought into the picture, I think planted in the minds of many of its partners, no, the possibility that, look, the American political system is too unstable, too unpredictable for us to really count on the United States, no, on a fairly regular basis, no. So there's that kind of concern, I think, and so my suspicion is that many of the, not just ASEAN, not just Korea, but I guess within Europe as well, no, there's now that wariness, if you will, no, about fully trusting the United States, no, as far as its strategic calculations are actually concerned, no, and so which brings us to this question of the East China Sea. No, in other words, to what extent can we actually say that ASEAN has a role to play there? It's minimal, right? Because but Seksan has pointed out as well that look, Singapore provided the venue for the North Korea-US talks, right? In other words, this is very traditional as far as ASEAN is concerned. ASEAN centrality can be defined in terms of being able to provide a venue where dialogue takes place, right? So I think that's how we can actually see the continuing role of ASEAN in this context. And very quickly, as far as Seksan's points were concerned, I agree with you with the points that you actually made regarding the continuing importance of public opinion, for instance, no, and domestic politics, no, and so to a large extent, public diplomacy becomes important because you're influencing people rather than governments, right? So that there's that kind of it's reaching out to a different audience, no, not to officials, right? And hopefully in that way, somehow it percolates upwards, no, in terms of the good feeling, so to speak, no. But I think you're right. China is not ready to be a global leader. But on the other hand, neither can I see the United States actually, countries willing to put their complete trust again in the United States, right? So I think we're looking at a multipolar situation that's emerging, no, short of assuming that somehow we are going to be able to prevent, the rivalry between China and the United States from really wreaking havoc across the globe. So thank you very much for your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Kraft, for your very insightful response. May we now move to Dr. Capistrano for your comments?
Yeah. All right. So yeah, first of all, thank you for those insights. And yeah, it actually brings me to a point wherein the whole study moves forward, and gives me an opportunity to explore this issue further. The short answer to both of your both sets of questions is that ask me again after November. because as Professor Kraft mentioned, my frustration about the North and South Korean relations issue is how unstable the United States administration is right now, to the point that President Trump attempted to use the North-South Korean issue as his means to gain the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's very selfish. It's a very selfish agenda. So, and there's no sincerity behind that. And for me, at least as far as my opinion on this concern, he's just muddling up the issue all the more, and it puts the entire region, the entire East Asian region, in such an uncertainty that it's very difficult to call right now. How do we sustain these movements? Probably just to answer the question of sustainability, you need to have a very stable world power, with that, and that goes for both the United States and China, because those two have very huge interests in the region. So that's one. The second issue when it comes to sustainability would be the buy-in of the different stakeholders. The problem, especially with sports, especially on an international or global level, is the amount of funding that's needed to actually participate in the Olympics or in ASEAN Games. There's a lot of private sponsorship that's happening there. I remember when I was young, I thought the United States, the Dream Team, yeah, I thought the Dream Team was sponsored by the United States government. It's not. It's a private organization. And they just so happen to carry the stars and stripes. So that's the other thing. How do you get the private entities on board as well, so that they can continue funding and sponsoring these kinds of events that would further the relations. For instance, in the World Taekwondo Federations of both North Korea and South Korea, how do you ensure continuous funding? How do you ensure continuous stability in the leadership of these organizations? What's one thing is worrisome right now in the South Korean Taekwondo Federation is that there are allegations of corruptions and sexual harassment that were reported. So that brings down the credibility of the Taekwondo Federation, and credibility is a very key pillar in diplomacy. You don't have the credibility, how dare you try to negotiate? So that's the second one. So again, first of all, would be the stability of the political systems of the world powers, especially in the United States. So let's see come November. And then second would be the buying in of the big stakeholders that are involved in international sports. Well, Hallyu, it's primarily a private venture. Yeah, so as what I've said a couple of weeks ago, and as what Professor Shim said a couple of weeks ago during the CLOI forum of KRC, government has very little to do with with Hallyu. That's basically a private venture. So at least just to immediately answer those questions, I think those are the two things that we need better support on if we are to sustain this these resources of soft power.
Thank you very much, Dr. Capistrano, for your response. So unfortunately, due to time constraints, we can only consolidate all of the questions raised by our participants today. So please allow me to show this consolidated question for the final open forum. So Professor Kraft and Dr. Capistrano can answer this in more or less 3 minutes as well. So how do you see South Korea demonstrating its capacity as a middle power state vis-a-vis gaining ASEAN support in inter-Korean relations? So Professor Kraft, would you like to answer first?
We can already see this. No, it's an attempt on the part of South Korea to actually support ASEAN. No, committing to all of the initiatives that actually ASEAN has actually promoted. And I think the way that this actually goes around to the inter-Korean relations is that in supporting ASEAN, no, ASEAN gains enough credibility for it to be acceptable. It already is to a certain extent, not to North Korea, and in that way, no, it might in fact be in a position to not so much influence, but to be able to provide the mechanisms, no, where North Korea, no, might consider, no, the idea of actually working with South Korea via ASEAN, right? In other words, it's a rather circuitous way, no, but in supporting and strengthening ASEAN, no, ASEAN, which already has some sort of relationship with North Korea, might be able then might become the conduit, no, that helps South Korea and North Korea to actually maintain some sort of bridge between them that allows the continuation of dialogue, no, exchanges, no, and all of those things, and all of the things that Erik has actually been pointing to, for instance, no, could actually be provided through some sort of but ASEAN can play that sort of conduit, no, and I think in a sense South Korea actually supporting ASEAN is in a way of is a circuitous way of actually getting to potentially getting to North Korea.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kraft. Dr. Capistrano, would you like to try to answer the question?
Yeah, I was probably would echo what Professor Kraft mentioned. So it's like, yeah, I was thinking maybe because like a number of ASEAN nations already have ties or relations with North Korea, so that the very instinct there would be to offer as a venue for North and South to talk to come to a common neutral ground and start talking about it. But one thing I would like to point out as well is that a lot of ASEAN nations should understand that how South Korea probably portrays North Korea in terms of its K-drama content. We have to realize that we have to go beyond that. There's a lot of criticism regarding how K-dramas portray North Korea, to the point that that the North Koreans actually issued a protest on Crash Landing on You, which will be discussed in 2 weeks' time. So that's part of it. So that would be very interesting to see. So like ASEAN needs to understand that there's more to North Korea than what South Korea is telling us. But the thing is, like, by having that kind of view wherein, okay, this is what they see, this is what they know about it, then it's actually, yeah, it can be a venue wherein with that one. Jakarta Asian Games is probably a breakthrough. I would have to go back that, because by hosting North Korean athletes there, it's already an example that we can get the North Koreans on board some international endeavors, even if it's just for a temporary thing. So yeah. And for that matter, the third part would be that ASEAN should also have like a stronger voice as far as like North Koreans and South Korea relations is concerned. One thing I'm always frustrated is how Western media actually portrays this have their commentaries regarding North Korean participation in the Olympics and in the Asian Games. So if ASEAN can have like a stronger voice on it, like they have their own thing, and not just let the Western media outlets say what they want to say or say how they think they say, and provide their own views on the situation, then we can probably get somewhere as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Capistrano, for your response. And with that, we formally conclude today's open forum. So thank you very much to all of our participants. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, to our speakers, discussants, and participants for joining us today in this very fruitful second session of the 3rd Philippine Koreanist Congress. So we have learned a lot today about the Republic of Korea's emerging regional role in ASEAN, and we've also seen how middle powers can be characterized by their deft use of soft power resources. So we hope to see you in next week's session of the Congress on Friday, October 9, from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock p.m. Manila time. So this session will feature presentations from Dr. Koo Chul Jung, who will present on policy and perceptions towards North Korea towards assimilation approach, and Professor Mark Isla, who will present a comparative study on refugee policies of the Republic of Korea and the Philippines. So that is next Friday, October 9, from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock p.m. Manila time. So for more updates on the Congress and future events by organizers, you may visit the Facebook page of UPKRC, and you may also subscribe to its YouTube channel. So we would like to announce that we will upload today's session by tomorrow in the UPKRC's YouTube channel. So please stay tuned for more updates. And with that, we formally conclude this afternoon session. So we hope to see you all next Friday. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.